The rifle barrel was already pressing against the back of his skull before Jacob Mercer heard the footsteps. He froze mid-swing, the axe suspended above the log, splinters of wood still hanging in the evening air. The voice that followed was not what he expected, low, rough, and unmistakably female. "Drop the axe, slowly." Jacob let the tool fall into the dirt. He raised his hands, palms open, and turned his head just enough to catch a glimpse of his visitor. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, her shadow stretching across the entire clearing like a dark monument. Her skin was sun-scorched bronze, muscles rippling beneath a torn buckskin tunic stained with dried blood. Her eyes were the color of amber catching firelight, fierce, calculating and exhausted all at once. "You alone out here?" she asked, the rifle never wavering. Jacob nodded slowly. "Been alone for 3 years now." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze sweeping over the modest farmstead, the weathered cabin, the small corral with 2 horses, the vegetable patch struggling against the harsh Arizona soil. Then she lowered the rifle, just slightly, though her finger remained on the trigger. "I need water, food, and I need you to forget you ever saw me." Jacob turned around fully now, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. Up close, he could see the details, the rope burns on her wrists, raw and infected, the bruises along her collarbone, the way she favored her left leg. Blood seeped through a crude bandage wrapped around her thigh. "You're hurt," Jacob said. "I said water and food, not conversation." Jacob gestured toward the cabin. "Well, both of those are inside. You coming, or you planning to shoot me out here?" For the first time, something flickered across her face. Not quite surprise, but close to it. She had expected fear, maybe pleading. What she got instead was a tired farmer with dust on his boots and resignation in his eyes. She followed him inside, the rifle still raised, her head nearly brushing the doorframe as she ducked through. The cabin was small but clean. A single room with a stone fireplace, a cot in the corner, shelves lined with canned goods and dried meat. Jacob moved to the water barrel and filled a tin cup, then set it on the table along with a plate of cornbread and salted pork. "Eat," he said simply, then stepped back to give her space. She did not lower the rifle. Not yet, but her eyes locked onto the food with an intensity that spoke of days without eating. Slowly she sat, if it could be called sitting. Her frame was so massive that the wooden chair creaked in protest. She ate with one hand, the rifle balanced across her lap with the other, never taking her eyes off Jacob. "What's your name?" he asked after a while. She did not answer immediately. She chewed slowly, washed it down with water, then set the cup down with a heavy thud. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, though no less dangerous. "Ayita." "Apache?" Her jaw tightened. "Does that scare you?" Jacob shrugged. "Should it?" Ayita stared at him, trying to read the man standing before her. He was not particularly tall, maybe 5'10", with sun-bleached hair and a face carved by wind and solitude. His hands were calloused, his clothes patched in multiple places. He looked like every other white settler she had ever seen, except for the way he looked at her, not with disgust or greed, but with something closer to indifference, as if finding a towering Apache woman bleeding in his yard was just another Tuesday. "I killed 3 men 2 days ago," she said, her tone flat. "They were taking me to Fort Grant to sell me to a brothel. I broke my chains, crushed one skull with a rock, strangled the second, shot the third with his own gun. Now there's a bounty on my head." Jacob absorbed this information with the same calm he had shown since the moment the rifle touched his neck. He walked to the fireplace and stoked the embers, adding a fresh log. "Well," he said without turning around, I don't work for Fort Grant, and I don't much care for men who trade in people. Ayita's grip on the rifle loosened, just a fraction. Why? Why what? Why don't you care? Jacob turned to face her, the firelight casting long shadows across his weathered features. Because I've seen what men like that do. Lost my wife to a group of outlaws 5 years back. They took her from the trading post in Tucson, did things no man should ever do to another human being, then left her body in the desert for the buzzards. He paused, his voice dropping to something raw and hollowed out. I found her 3 days later, so no, I don't have much sympathy for men who deal in flesh. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Ayita set the rifle down on the table, the first time since entering the cabin. She leaned back in the chair, wincing as the movement pulled at her injured leg. "You should let me look at that," Jacob said, nodding toward her thigh. "I can manage. Infection will kill you faster than any bounty hunter." Ayita held his gaze for a long moment, then slowly pulled aside the torn fabric of her tunic. The wound was deep, a jagged gash from a knife, poorly stitched with what looked like sinew. The flesh around it was swollen and angry red. Jacob moved to a shelf and retrieved a bottle of whiskey, a needle, clean thread, and a jar of salve made from desert plants. He knelt beside her without asking permission, his hands steady as he poured whiskey over the wound. Ayita hissed through her teeth, but did not pull away. "This is going to hurt," Jacob warned. "Everything hurts." He worked in silence, removing the crude stitches and cleaning the wound properly before re-stitching it with practiced precision. Ayita watched him the entire time, her jaw clenched, sweat beading on her forehead. When he finished, he applied the salve and wrapped it with clean bandages. "You've done this before," she observed. "War, and living alone teaches you a lot about fixing yourself up." Jacob stood and washed his hands in a basin. Ayita remained seated, flexing her leg experimentally. The pain was still there, but duller now, manageable. "You can stay the night," Jacob said, moving to the cot. "I'll sleep on the floor. In the morning, you take whatever supplies you need and go." "Just like that?" "Just like that." Ayita studied him again, this quiet man with tired eyes and rough hands. She had expected violence or betrayal. Instead, she found something she had not encountered in years: simple, uncomplicated decency. "Why?" she asked again, the question carrying more weight this time. Jacob settled onto the floor, using his coat as a blanket. He stared up at the ceiling beams, his voice soft in the darkness. "Because out here we're all just trying to survive. And I've got no interest in making that harder for anyone." Ayita said nothing, but as the fire burned low and the desert night pressed against the cabin walls, she allowed herself to close her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she slept without one hand on a weapon. Morning came with the harsh slant of Arizona sun cutting through the single window. Jacob woke to find Ayita already awake, standing by the door, staring out at the barren landscape beyond. She had cleaned herself up as best she could, her long black hair tied back, the dried blood washed from her face. In the daylight, she looked even more imposing, a warrior carved from stone and fury. "Coffee?" Jacob offered, moving to the stove. She turned, and for the first time, he saw something other than suspicion in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the faint possibility of it. "You have coffee?" "Not much, but enough." They sat across from each other at the small table, steam rising from the tin cups between them. The silence was no longer hostile, but it was not quite comfortable either. It was the silence of two people circling each other, trying to decide what came next. "Thank you for being here with me in this journey through the dust and danger of the Old West. If you felt the heat of the desert sun on your face, or the weight of these hard choices in your chest. I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every voice matters here, and every story we share together keeps these legends alive. "Where will you go?" Jacob asked finally. Aita wrapped her hands around the cup, absorbing its warmth. "North, maybe Colorado territory, somewhere they won't recognize me." "That's a long way on foot, especially with that leg." "I'll manage." Jacob took a sip of his coffee, considering. "I've got an extra horse. Old mare, but she's steady. You can take her." Aita's eyes narrowed. "Why would you do that?" "Because walking to Colorado will get you killed." "You don't know me." "Don't need to." She set the cup down with more force than necessary. "Everyone wants something. What is it you want from me?" Jacob met her gaze without flinching. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing." It was the honesty in his voice that broke through her defenses. Not the words themselves, but the absolute certainty behind them. This man truly expected nothing in return. The concept was so foreign to Aita that she did not know how to respond. "I could kill you," she said, testing him. "Take everything you have." "You could," Jacob agreed, "but you won't." "How do you know?" "Because if you were that kind of person, you would have done it already." Aita leaned back in her chair, studying this strange, quiet man who seemed to see through every wall she had ever built. In her 28 years of life, she had known violence, betrayal, and survival. She had learned to trust no one, to rely only on her own strength. But here, in this tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere, she found herself considering something dangerous, the possibility that not everyone was an enemy. "I'll take the horse," she said finally, "but I'll work for it." "A few days. I can chop wood, mend fences, whatever you need." Jacob shook his head. "That's not necessary." "It is to me." There was steel in her voice, the pride of a warrior who refused charity. Jacob understood that. He nodded slowly. "All right. A few days." Those few days stretched into a week, then 2. Aita proved to be exactly what she claimed, a warrior through and through. She could split logs with the same efficiency Jacob had spent years developing. She repaired the corral fence in half the time it would have taken him. She even helped dig a new irrigation channel for the struggling vegetable patch, her powerful frame making quick work of the hard-packed earth. Jacob watched her work, marveling at her strength and determination. But he also noticed the small things, the way she winced when she thought no one was looking, the nightmares that woke her in the dark hours before dawn, the way her hand still reached for a weapon that was not there whenever a coyote howled in the distance. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sun bleed red across the horizon, Jacob broke the silence. "You don't have to keep running." Aita turned to him, her expression guarded. "Yes, I do. Not from here. They'll come looking for me eventually." "Maybe. But by then, we'll figure something out." "We?" The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jacob met her eyes steadily. "You've been here 2 weeks. You've worked harder than any hired hand I've ever had. And honestly," he allowed himself a small, tired smile, "it's nice having someone around. Gets lonely out here." Aita looked away, her jaw working as she processed this. In Apache culture, directness was valued. But this kind of directness, this vulnerability from a man she barely knew, was something else entirely. "I'm not easy to be around," she said finally. "Neither am I. I have nightmares. I wake up ready to fight. So do I. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am." Jacob stood and brushed the dust from his pants. "And what you are is someone who survived, someone strong, someone who deserves a place to rest." He paused, then added, if you want it." Aita remained silent, watching as Jacob walked back toward the cabin. For the first time in years, she felt something crack in her chest, not breaking, but opening. A space where something other than anger and fear might grow. That night, she did not sleep in the barn. She accepted Jacob's repeated offer to take the cot while he slept on the floor, and when the nightmares came, when she woke, gasping and reaching for a knife, it was Jacob's calm voice that brought her back. "You're safe. You're here. You're safe." The third week brought trouble. Jacob was working in the field when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon, 3 riders approaching fast. He straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead, and felt his stomach tighten. Aita was at the creek, washing clothes. She looked up at the same moment, her warrior instincts reading the danger before it arrived. They met at the cabin. Jacob grabbed his rifle while Aita positioned herself inside, out of sight, but ready. "Stay hidden," Jacob said. "No. Aita, if they're here for me, I won't let you die for it." Jacob wanted to argue, but the riders were already too close. He stepped onto the porch, rifle held loosely but ready. The 3 men reined in their horses, raising dust that settled slowly in the still air. The leader was a thick-built man with a deputy's badge pinned to his vest, though it looked more decorative than official. The other 2 were clearly hired guns, cold eyes and quick hands. "Afternoon," the deputy said, though his smile did not reach his eyes. "Name's Garrett, looking for someone." "Lot of empty land out here," Jacob replied. "Doubt you'll find anyone." Garrett's smile widened into something predatory. "Apache woman, real tall, probably armed and dangerous. Word is she killed 3 men up near Tucson, bounties $500. Haven't seen anyone matching that description. Mind if we look around?" "Yes, I do mind." The deputy's expression hardened. "Now, friend, we can do this easy or—" The cabin door opened. Aita stepped out, and all 3 men went still. She was even more imposing than the wanted posters had described, her presence filling the space like a gathering storm. She held no weapon, but she did not need one. Everything about her radiated controlled violence. "I'm right here," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing. "No need to search." Garrett recovered first, his hand dropping to his pistol. "Well now, that was easier than expected." "Leave," Aita said. "This is your only warning." The deputy laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're in no position to give warning, squaw. You're worth $500. Dead or alive, poster says. Makes no difference to me." Jacob stepped between them, the rifle now raised. "But it makes a difference to me." "Mercer, don't be stupid. She's a murderer. She killed men who were trafficking her. That's not murder. That's justice. Law doesn't see it that way." "Then the law is wrong." The tension stretched taut as a wire. The 2 hired guns shifted in their saddles, hands hovering near their weapons. Aita remained perfectly still, calculating distances, angles, which one she would kill first if this went bad. Garrett spat into the dust. "You're harboring a fugitive. That makes you complicit." "She's not a fugitive. She's my wife." The words dropped like stones into water, sending ripples of shock through everyone present. Aita's head snapped toward Jacob, her eyes wide. The deputy's face twisted with disgust. "You're what?" "My wife," Jacob repeated, his voice steady and clear. "We were married 3 weeks ago in Prescott, so unless you've got a federal warrant, and I'm guessing you don't, you've got no business here." Garrett's hand twitched toward his gun, but Jacob's rifle never wavered. The math was simple. He could maybe draw and shoot Jacob, but Aita would tear him apart before he got a second shot off. and his hired guns were not paid enough to fight a giant Apache warrior in close quarters. "This ain't over," Garrett finally said, yanking his horse's reins. "I'll be checking on that marriage claim. If you're lying, I'm not." The three riders turned and galloped away, leaving only dust and tension in their wake. Jacob lowered the rifle and turned to face Aita. She was staring at him with an expression he could not quite read. Shock, anger, confusion, maybe all three at once. "Why did you say that?" she demanded. "Because it was the only way to make them leave without bloodshed." "You lied. There's no marriage." Jacob set the rifle against the porch railing and met her eyes. "Doesn't have to be a lie. We can go to Prescott tomorrow. Make it official." Aita took a step back, her massive frame suddenly seeming smaller, more vulnerable. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm Apache, you're white. They'll spit on you, call you a traitor." "Let them. I'm a fugitive, a killer. You're a survivor." "Jacob!" Her voice cracked just slightly. "Why would you do this?" He moved closer, close enough that he had to tilt his head back to look at her properly. When he spoke, his voice was raw with honesty. "Because in the 3 weeks you've been here, I've felt more alive than I have in 5 years. Because you're the strongest person I've ever met, and I don't mean just physically, because when I wake up in the morning, I actually have a reason to get out of bed." He paused, then added softly, "And because I think, maybe, you feel something too." Aita's eyes were glistening now, though no tears fell. Warriors did not cry, but her voice shook when she finally spoke. "I don't know how to be someone's wife. I don't know how to be someone's husband. Not anymore. But we can figure it out together." She reached out, and her hand, so large it could crush a man's skull, gently cupped Jacob's face. Her thumb traced the line of his jaw, a touch so tender it contradicted everything about her fearsome appearance. "If we do this," she said slowly, "you need to understand something. I will never be small. I will never be quiet. I will never bow or submit or pretend to be less than what I am." Jacob smiled, the first genuine smile Aita had ever seen from him. "Good. Because I need someone strong enough to stand beside me, not behind me, beside me. And if they come back, if there's violence, then we face it, together." Aita leaned down, and Jacob rose on his toes, and their lips met in the middle, awkward because of the height difference, but perfect in every other way that mattered. When they pulled apart, Aita rested her forehead against his. "What do you want from me, Jacob Mercer?" she whispered. He answered without hesitation. "I want you to stay. I want you to be safe. I want you to build a life here." He paused, then added with a hint of humor, "And maybe teach me some of that Apache tracking you keep talking about." Despite everything, Aita laughed. A real laugh, deep and genuine, the sound of chains breaking. "All right," she said. "All right." They rode to Prescott the next morning, before dawn. The journey took most of the day, following old wagon trails through red rock canyons and across dry creek beds. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable now, the silence of two people who had found an unexpected anchor in each other. The town of Prescott was larger than Jacob's farm by 100 times. Dusty streets lined with saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, and a small courthouse that doubled as a church on Sundays. People stopped and stared as they passed. A white farmer and an 8-foot Apache woman riding side by side drew every eye and whisper. Jacob ignored them all. Aita held her head high, daring anyone to speak. The courthouse clerk was a thin, nervous man named Paulson, who nearly dropped his ledger when they walked in. "We're here to register a marriage," Jacob said simply. Paulson's eyes went wide as dinner plates. I'm sorry, what?" "A marriage. Me and her. Today. Sir, are you sure? Aita leaned over the desk, her shadow swallowing the clerk whole. Is there a law against it? No, ma'am, not exactly. But then get your pen and write. Paulson scrambled to comply, his hands shaking as he filled out the certificate. When he asked for witnesses, Jacob grabbed two men off the street, a blacksmith and a ranch hand who looked equal parts confused and terrified. They signed without asking questions. 10 minutes later, Jacob and Aita stood on the courthouse steps as husband and wife. No ceremony, no flowers, no celebration. Just two names on a piece of paper and the weight of a promise neither of them had expected to make. As they mounted their horses to leave, a voice called out from across the street, "Mercer, you goddamn fool!" It was Garrett, the deputy, flanked by his two hired guns. He stormed across the dusty street, his face red with rage. "I checked, just like I said I would. There was no marriage 3 weeks ago. You lied." Jacob remained calm, reaching into his saddlebag. He pulled out the fresh certificate and held it up. "No lie. We were married today, legal and witnessed. So unless you're planning to arrest half the town for watching, I suggest you move along." Garrett's hand hovered near his pistol. "This ain't right. This ain't natural." Aita's voice cut through the air like a blade. "What's not natural is men who trade in human flesh. What's not natural is hunting someone for defending themselves. What's not natural is you standing here thinking you have any say in my life." She spurred her horse forward, forcing Garrett to step back or be trampled. Jacob followed, and together they rode out of Prescott, leaving the deputy fuming in the street. They did not speak until they were miles outside of town. Then Aita pulled her horse to a stop and turned to Jacob. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" she said. "You've tied yourself to me. If they come for me again, they'll come for you too." Jacob met her gaze without fear. "Then they'll have to deal with both of us." Aita shook her head, but she was smiling now, that rare, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met, or the most foolish." "Can't I be both?" She laughed again, and the sound carried across the empty desert like a song. The weeks that followed were not easy. Word spread quickly through the territory. Jacob Mercer had married an Apache giant, a fugitive, a killer. Some called him a traitor, others called him insane. A few merchants in Prescott refused to sell to him. The ranch hand who had witnessed their marriage spat at Jacob's feet the next time they crossed paths. But Jacob did not waver, and neither did Aita. They worked the farm together side by side. Jacob taught Aita how to coax life from the stubborn Arizona soil. Aita taught Jacob how to track game across rocky terrain, how to read the subtle signs of weather changes, how to move through the desert like a ghost. At night, they sat by the fire and talked, not about the past. That was too heavy, too painful, but about the future, what crops they might try next season, whether they should build an addition to the cabin. Small things, but they mattered because they were shared. There were difficult moments. Aita still woke with nightmares, still reached for weapons that were not there. Jacob still grieved his first wife in quiet, private ways. But they learned to navigate each other's wounds with care, to give space when needed and closeness when wanted. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Aita spoke quietly. "I never thought I would have this." "Have what?" Jacob asked. "Peace, a home, someone who sees me as more than just a thing." Jacob reached over and took her hand, his fingers small against her palm. "You're not a thing, you never were." Aita squeezed gently, careful not to hurt him. "I know that now." They sat in silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was a blanket of light. And in that moment, despite everything they had survived, despite the violence and loss and hardship, they were simply two people who had found each other in the vastness of the West. 4 months after their marriage, trouble returned. Jacob was repairing the roof when he saw the riders, not 3 this time, but 7. Garrett was at the front, and beside him rode a man in a black suit with a silver badge that marked him as a U.S. Marshal. Real authority, not the frontier mockery Garrett represented. Jacob climbed down from the roof and called for Aita. She emerged from the barn, a pitchfork in hand, her expression unreadable. "Stay behind me," Jacob said quietly. "No." "Aita, we stand together. That was the deal." The riders pulled up in front of the cabin. The marshal dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He was an older man, grey at the temples, with eyes that had seen too much death. "Jacob Mercer?" he asked. "That's me." The marshal nodded to Aita. "And you're the Apache woman known as Aita?" "I am. My name is Marshal Thomas Wade. I'm here because there's a matter that needs resolving." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "There's a warrant for your arrest, ma'am. 3 counts of murder." Jacob stepped forward. "Those men were trafficking her. She acted in self-defense." Wade held up a hand. "I know the circumstances. I've read the reports. I've talked to witnesses." He paused, then looked directly at Aita. "The men you killed were wanted in 3 territories: trafficking, assault, robbery. They were scum, pure and simple." Aita's grip on the pitchfork tightened. "Then why are you here?" "Because the law isn't always just, and because Garrett here filed a complaint." Wade glanced back at the deputy with barely concealed contempt. "But I'm also here because I wanted to see for myself what kind of person you are." "And what have you decided?" Jacob asked. The marshal folded the warrant and put it back in his coat. "I've decided that those men got what they deserved. I've decided that you two have built something here, and I've got no interest in tearing it apart." He turned to Garrett. "The warrant is being dismissed. Self-defense. Case closed." Garrett exploded. "You can't do that. She's a murderer." "No, deputy, she's a survivor. There's a difference." Wade mounted his horse and looked down at Garrett with cold finality. "You want to keep your badge. You'll drop this obsession. Otherwise, I'll make sure everyone knows you tried to collect bounty money on a legal case of self-defense. Understood?" Garrett's face went purple with rage, but he said nothing. Wade tipped his hat to Jacob and Aita. "Good luck to you both. You're going to need it out here." Then he rode away, taking the other riders with him. Garrett lingered for a moment, glaring at Aita with pure hatred, before finally spurring his horse and disappearing in a cloud of dust. Aita lowered the pitchfork, her hands shaking slightly. Jacob put his arm around her waist, or as far around as he could reach, and held her steady. "It's over," he said quietly. "Is it?" "The law says so. That's all that matters." Aita leaned into him, this impossibly small man who had stood between her and violence without hesitation. "How do you do it?" she whispered. "How do you stay so calm?" "Because I've already lost everything once. I'm not losing you." She pulled back to look at him, her amber eyes searching his face. Then she did something she had never done before. She knelt down, lowering herself until they were eye to eye. She cupped his face in both hands. "Jacob Mercer," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "You are the smallest man I have ever known, and the strongest." He smiled, tears tracking through the dust on his cheeks. "And you're the biggest woman I've ever known, and the gentlest." They kissed there, in the dirt, with the sun beating down and the wind whispering through the desert scrub. Two people who should never have met, who should never have survived, who had somehow found in each other the one thing the West so rarely offered: hope. A year passed, then two. The farm prospered slowly, as all things in the desert do. Jacob and Aita expanded the vegetable patch, added more livestock, even managed to trade with some of the nearby Apache bands, who remembered Aita from before her capture. She became a bridge between two worlds, respected by her people and grudgingly accepted by the white settlers who realized she was there to stay. One spring morning, Aita woke with a strange feeling in her stomach. Not illness, but something else. Something that made her pause in the doorway of the cabin and place a hand over her abdomen. Jacob noticed immediately. "You all right?" "I don't know," she admitted. By evening she knew. Her body told her in ways that could not be mistaken. She waited until after dinner, until they were sitting outside watching the stars, before she spoke. "Jacob, I'm carrying a child." He went very still. Then he turned to look at her, his eyes wide with wonder and fear in equal measure. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Jacob stood and paced for a moment, running his hands through his hair. Then he stopped and looked at her, really looked at her, and burst into laughter. Not mocking laughter, but the kind that comes from pure, overwhelming joy. "We're having a baby," he said, as if saying it out loud would make it real. "We are." He rushed over and wrapped his arms around her as far as they would go, which was not very far at all. Aita pulled him into her lap, holding him like he was something precious and fragile. "Are you happy?" she asked quietly. "Happy?" Jacob pulled back to look at her. "Aita, I thought I was done. I thought my life was just existing until I died, and then you showed up and everything changed. So yes, I'm happy. I'm terrified, but I'm happy." Aita smiled, that rare, beautiful smile. "Good, because I'm terrified too." The pregnancy was not easy. Aita's size meant complications, and Jacob spent many sleepless nights worrying. But she was strong, stronger than anyone he had ever known, and she carried the child with the same determination she brought to everything. 8 months later, on a cold November night, their daughter was born. She came into the world screaming, with her mother's strength and her father's stubbornness. The midwife from Prescott, a tough old woman named Martha, who had delivered half the babies in the territory, looked at the infant and shook her head in wonder. "She's already the size of a 3-month-old, Martha said. "Takes after her mother." Aita held her daughter carefully, this tiny person who was somehow already larger than most newborns. The baby had Jacob's light hair, but Aita's amber eyes, a perfect blending of two worlds. "What will you name her?" Martha asked. Aita looked at Jacob, and he looked back at her. They had discussed this, argued about it, laughed about it. In the end, they chose a name that honored both of their pasts while looking toward the future. "Sarah," Jacob said, "after my mother. And Nayeli," Aita added, "after mine." "Sarah Nayeli Mercer," Martha repeated, testing the name. "That's a strong name. She'll need it, growing up as she will." It was true. Sarah would face challenges neither parent could fully protect her from: the prejudice of white settlers, the suspicion of Apache tribes, the simple fact of being different in a world that valued sameness. But as Jacob and Aita looked at their daughter, they saw not obstacles but possibilities. "She'll be all right," Aita said quietly, "because she'll have both of us." Jacob kissed his daughter's forehead, then looked up at his wife. "And because she'll be stronger than either of us alone." The years rolled by like seasons, each one adding layers to their story. Sarah grew quickly, inheriting her mother's height and strength. By age 5, she was nearly as tall as her father. By 10, she could outwork most adult men. But she also inherited her father's kindness and her mother's fierce sense of justice. The farm became known throughout the territory, not as the place where a white man married an Apache giant, but as a place where anyone could find fair trade and honest dealing. Apache travelers stopped there for supplies and news. White settlers grudgingly admitted that Jacob and Aita ran the most reliable operation in 3 counties. Garrett never forgave them. He left Prescott eventually, driven out by his own bitterness. But there were others like him, men who saw Aita and Sarah as threats simply for existing. There were incidents, threats, vandalism, once even an attempt to burn down the barn. But each time, Jacob and Aita faced it together. And each time, they survived. One evening when Sarah was 12 years old, she asked her mother a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Mama, do you ever wish you were somewhere else? Somewhere where people didn't stare?" Aita was teaching her daughter to braid rope, their hands moving in tandem. She paused and looked at Sarah, seeing so much of herself in those amber eyes. "Every day," Aita admitted. "But then I look at you, and I look at your father, and I realize that this," she gestured to the farm, the cabin, the wide desert stretching to the horizon, "this is home, not because it's easy, but because it's ours. But people hate us. Some do, others don't, and the ones who matter, they see us for what we are, a family." Sarah considered this, then nodded slowly. "Papa says the same thing." "Your papa is wiser than he looks," Aita said with a smile. "He's also shorter than he looks," Sarah added with perfect deadpan timing. Aita laughed, and Sarah joined her, and the sound carried across the desert like a promise. On their 15th anniversary, Jacob woke before dawn to find Aita already awake, sitting on the porch, watching the sun rise. He joined her, bringing 2 cups of coffee. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, as they had done countless times over the years. 15 years, Jacob said finally. "Never thought I'd make it this long." "Neither did I," Aita admitted. "I thought I would die alone, fighting, angry at the world. And now?" She turned to look at him, this man who had never asked her to be anything other than herself. "Now I wake up every day grateful that Deputy came looking for me, because if he hadn't, I never would have found you." Jacob set down his coffee and took her hand. "Do you remember what you asked me? That first week? I asked you many things. You asked what I wanted from you, and I said I wanted you to stay, to be safe, to build a life." He squeezed her hand gently. "I got all of that, and more than I ever could have imagined." Aita leaned down and kissed him, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted like coffee and morning air. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "Jacob Mercer, you asked me once if I would stay or run. I chose to stay, and I would make that choice again, every single day." "Even with everything we've been through?" "Especially with everything we've been through." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. Behind them, in the cabin, their daughter still slept, dreaming whatever dreams children dream. Around them, the land they had fought for, built on and made their own, stretched out in all directions. It was not an easy life. The West never promised easy. But it was theirs, earned through blood and sweat, and the simple, stubborn decision to choose each other, again and again, no matter what the world said, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Epilogue. Years later, when Jacob was old and grey, when Aita's hair had turned silver, but her strength had never faded, when Sarah had children of her own, they would sit on that same porch and tell their story. Not all of it. Some wounds were too private to share. But enough that their grandchildren understood. Love was not something that happened easily. It was not a fairy tale or a fantasy. Love was choosing someone every day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. "How did you know?" one of the grandchildren asked Aita. "How did you know Grandpa was the one?" Aita thought for a long moment, her weathered face creasing with memory. Then she smiled. "Because when he looked at me, he did not see a monster or a prize. He saw a person." And that made all the difference. Jacob, sitting beside her, took her hand in his. After all these years, his hand still looked absurdly small in hers, but the fit was perfect. "And because," he added with a wink at his grandchildren, "your grandmother was too stubborn to run away." Aita laughed, and the sound carried across the farm they had built together, across the life they had carved out of hardship and hope. In the end, love was not about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth building a life with, one day at a time. And in the vast, unforgiving West, that was the greatest legend of all.